Next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Lloyd Anderson, President of City Club. Welcome to our program today. Today we'll look at what's up in Washington, D.C. from the perspective of Oregon's Representative David Wu. This is the third program in our Potomac series. On Friday, December the 17th, celebrate the season with your fellow club members at our special holiday program, once again featuring the Oregon Repertory Singers that'll be at the Molten Athletic Club. On Friday, December 24th, surprise of surprises, there'll be no program. Enjoy a good Christmas holiday. Our annual fund for this year was $100,000. We're still $25,000 short from our goal. So please, those of you that are making your individual contributions, do so as quickly as you can. Before we move to our program today, Rod Merrick, co-chair of the club's Growth Management and Environment Issue Committee, will provide us a brief overview of the committee's agenda.
Good afternoon. I hope I didn't miss my cue by too much time. Just to give you a very short description of the work of one of the club's important activities, which is the Growth Management and Environment Issues Committee, and some of the kinds of things that we've been doing this year. The issue committee, our issue committee, has about 80 members on our email and surface mail list. And we regularly have 20 to 30 guests attending. And they vary depending upon the interest, and you can track what we're doing pretty much by reading the bulletin. This year we've had a couple of very interesting talks. We've had Metro Commissioner David Bragdon and a fellow committee member Rex Burkholder discussing the Metro Regional Transportation Plan, which is under development right now. In October, we had Joe Courtwright, an economist, talking about job growth, particularly in high tech in the region. If you had been there, you would have had a preview of the talk at the bi-state breakfast at a much lower cost. In November, we had Greg Goodman, Greg Baldwin, Keith Winkowski talking about the West End plan for downtown Portland. Also in November, co-chair Bruce Pearson organized a field trip with the Bureau of Environmental Services to look at sensitive watershed areas in the city. And in our December meeting, we had Dean Marriott of the Bureau of Environmental Services and others discussing the efforts to address stormwater and water quality issues in the entire Willamette Basin. So we've tried to balance environmental issues and urban design issues and regional growth issues. In January, we'll have John Southgate of the Portland Development Commission talking about the north-north light rail lines redevelopment efforts along North Interstate, and we'll be learning about displacement issues of local businesses and residents and how they're addressing those kinds of concerns. Also in January, there'll be our Assumptions of Growth Subcommittee will be discussing, we'll be having a meeting with John Fraganese and a member of the Association for Portland Progress to discuss the different directions that downtown might take in terms of its emphasis on housing, jobs, entertainment, and there are various visions of that. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing, and we encourage anyone who's interested to participate, and anybody who has a growth management environment related concern who would like to sort of fit under that general wing can come and, in fact, establish your own issue or study group as a subcommittee. So I'd like to thank you very much for your concern and turn this back over to Lloyd. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rod. Our member host seated at the head table today is Arnold Kogan of Kogan, Owens, and Kogan. They're involved in planning, communication, government relations, environmental studies, and he assures me that it's his brother that does dental work. Following Arnold's question, we will open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please limit your questions to 30 seconds or less. We want to hear what our speaker has to say, not speeches from the floor. If you have a question and don't want to ask it yourself, we encourage City Club members to write them on question cards and raise your hand, and a staff member will bring them up to the head table to be asked. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible by corporate underwriting from Providence Health Plans, U.S. Bank, Washington Mutual Savings Bank. We're very grateful for their support. We're in the midst of one of the greatest economic growth periods in our history. Our first balanced federal budget in over 20 years. Major crime is down. Our Congress and our President are each taking credit. That's a practice not uncommon for the last 200 years of our country. As election year approaches, maybe a little early. But some goats hang around with no one taking credit. More people without health care, a lack of a plan for Social Security funding, and some disturbing events overseas. But no one is saying the sky is falling yet, only if the other guy's elected. The first congressional district was never a shoo-in for candidates from either party in recent times. And the district has changed. The boundaries, the economy, and the politics. It now includes Washington, Yamhill, Columbia, and Clatsop counties, and parts of Multnomah and Clackamas counties. Employment in lumber and wood products, farming, fishing is giving way to the Silicon Forest of Washington County. And the constituency is less predictable. But interestingly, Walter Norblad, Wendell Wyatt, Les Aucoin, and Elizabeth First were all re-elected in a district if they chose to run again. David Wu's first election was hard-fought and close. That's not a builder of confidence for a future cakewalk. But he was never promised a rose garden. In the last election, the House of Representatives came close to being democratically controlled, a likely reason why a close race in the last round may be a target race this time. No rest for you, David. He is the first Chinese American elected to the House of Representatives. David serves on the Committee on Education and Workforce and subcommittees on early childhood, youth and families, and employer-employee relations. And he's also on the Committee on Science. His priorities include public education through reducing class size and modernizing schools, promoting continued economic growth through job training, safety in schools, preserving Social Security, and environmental issues. David is a native of Taiwan, came to us in the United States in the early 60s. He's a graduate of Stanford with a Bachelor of Science, attended Harvard Medical School, and received a law degree from Yale. He served as a law clerk for a federal judge in Portland and practiced law in a joint partnership which he founded in 1988. David continues to try to keep his principles supporting his principles. David, we're pleased to have you as our speaker. David?
Lloyd, thank you very much for the kind and detailed introduction. It's wonderful to be back with the City Club among so many people that I know. Dan and Rusty Goldie are right here. Mike Console is right behind them, and another publisher, Bud Forrester, in the back. And they're just lots and lots of folks, and I'm deeply honored to be the speaker today. But after 15 years off and on being in this audience, I have to say that I'm not just deeply honored to be here, but somewhat overawed to be invited to come back and speak. I mean, in thinking about this, do I know more about transportation than Ray Palani? I don't think so. Do I know more about health care than Governor John Kitzhaber, who's spoken here several times? I don't think so. I sort of developed a block about giving this talk. And finally, yesterday morning, I woke up about 5 o'clock in the morning, and sort of a deathly fear that I would have absolutely nothing to say today. And for those of you who know me, you're probably a little shocked and mostly incredulous that David Wu would have nothing to say. But this is indeed the way that I felt at that early hour yesterday morning. As I thought about it a little bit more, I realized that perhaps the reason why I felt I had nothing to say was because I had set my standard sky high. I thought I need to think deep thoughts, share something profound, and really reach for the sky in the City Club tradition and standard. And as I laid there thinking about it some more, finally it occurred to me that, I'm a little bit out of profound thoughts right now. It's been a long legislative session, 5,000 miles back and forth, at least all fall and most of the year. And we've really fought it out well and gotten some good results. I pretty much left it all on the field and was kind of out of deep thinking or profound thoughts of any kind. But around 6 or 6:30 in the morning, it finally dawned on me, literally dawned on me, that perhaps the thing that might be most interesting to you all is just the experience that I have had, the experience of going from citizen to congressman, from basically your seat to my seat, from spending more than a dozen years sitting in the audience to standing before you today. And that's a process I know well and something that I'd like to share. I'd like to add that this transition that I've gone through is not all that uncommon. My immediate predecessor, Elizabeth Furs, was a citizen activist before taking the seat that I now hold. Ron Wyden was a citizen activist before becoming a member of Congress, and now our senior senator. And probably one of the great examples, Wayne Morse, went from law professor to teaching in the U.S. Senate. I think that it is one of the gifts of the American spirit that common everyday citizens are given extraordinary opportunities to contribute, and I'd like to share that experience with you all. And so what I'm going to do is try to give a relatively short talk and open it up for questions relatively quickly, and talk about the adjustment to being a member of Congress, and then touch upon a couple of important policy areas, things that I think are important to the congressional district and certainly to me, and touch upon some challenges for the near-term future, and then leave lots of time for questions. You might, if somebody wants to ask, gee, David, how how did you do at the WTO talks last week, after all? Other simple things like, I suppose there might be a transportation question or two, but I look forward to the Q's and A's. Let me start by talking about what this year has been, what the transition has been. And I'm going to focus a lot on the challenges, but let me make this very, very clear from the get-go. This is the best job that I have ever had. All the things that I used to volunteer on as a private citizen, by golly, I could get to spend all my time working on them now, and I get paid for it. It is a deep, deep honor. I try to walk above ground around the Capitol. There's a habit of walking through the tunnels, and I don't subscribe to that. There are several reasons to walk above ground. One is just to get some fresh air, but the other is, just cutting between buildings and seeing the Capitol dome. It's an inspirational sight. And it's not just the inspiration in Washington, D.C. It is driving around this congressional district, whether it is a urban setting in Northwest Portland, a suburban community like Tigard, or going through Mist or Vernonia, and going through every community and feeling not a burden of responsibility, but really a warm feeling of responsibility for doing the job as best I can. It is indeed an honor to be holding this job, and I'm not expressing this very, very well, but perhaps I can just illustrate. Freshmen are put into these tucked away offices in the House office buildings, and I occupy an office on the 5th floor of the Cannon House office building. Please come visit. You might have some difficulty finding it. But if you lean out my window just right, you have a commanding view of the Capitol dome, and you can see the very tip of the Washington Monument. But, not only is it, it's not just it's out of the way. I mean, it's quiet too there, and that's kind of nice. But every morning when I show up at work, when I get off that elevator all the way to the 5th floor, and I turn left out of that elevator bay, I look down the hallway, and I see the Oregon flag and the U.S. flag outside my door. It never fails to bring a spring to my step. I just wanted to make sure that I mention those things in the context of the challenges of the job. And the most fundamental challenge is that there is so darn much travel involved. The core issue is that there is a full-time job in Washington, D.C., there's a full-time job in Oregon. It's important to do your legislative work in Washington, and it is very important to keep on listening to your constituents in Oregon. And basically, it's a bi-coastal job connected by a 2,500-mile-long aluminum tube. Now, I am blessed that I love airplanes. I've spent a lot of time in airplanes, but the hard thing is being away from family. There really is no easy way to slice it. You can have your family in Washington, D.C. and come back to Oregon all the time, or you can have your family here and go to Washington midweek every week. There is no easy way to slice that up. And I guess the hardest thing is leaving every week and leaving our 2-year-old behind. And we have a brand new child, Sarah Elizabeth, born on September 27. Now, I bear up pretty well because I love airplanes and I have a lot of the upside of this job. But I'd like to take a moment and recognize my wife, Michelle, who's sitting right here, because she has all the downside of this and doesn't share in all of the upside. So I want to make sure that at every moment that I can, that all the recognition I can flows to folks who are sharing in the sacrifice. And thank you very much for giving all of us the opportunity. Thanks, folks. I really appreciate it. The payoff will come later. I really. As you all know, this is my very first public office, and during the course of the campaign and beyond, a lot of folks have asked me, isn't it really tough stepping stepping up like this into this office when you haven't held public office before. And I think that one of the surprising answers that came along during the course of the year is that no, it's really not a disadvantage on the work side of things in terms of adjusting to the job. In fact, it may be somewhat of an advantage, because I went in without any preconceptions of what the job would be like. I knew I had to learn fast. I knew I had to hire good people, listen to what they say, perhaps not always take their advice, but at least listen to what they say. And I knew that I had that hill to climb. And it's somewhat like developing countries in a sense. You know, when you don't have a laid-in infrastructure, sometimes you leap a generation and you can sort of catch up technologically a little bit more easily. That was my experience on the professional side, because this job, Congress is just a different beast. It's not like serving a state legislature. It's not like being a mayor on a city council. You don't know what's going to be happening next week. You might not know what's going to happen at the end of the week. You might not know, and quite frequently you don't know what the schedule is for the end of the day. I sort of term it surfing the wave, and that's because it feels like the terrain is changing underneath you all the time. And my high-tech background was excellent, absolutely excellent for adjusting to this environment. It's, you know, like surfing, it's all about adjusting to that change, and you know you're going to fall off periodically, but the key is to just get back on and then keep on adjusting to that change. The professional adjustment was relatively easy compared to some of the personal aspects. I touched upon the travel. There are other things that you all might know about or might not. For us, it became very, very important to have a place to live on either coast. So we have our home here in Oregon, eventually got a place in Washington, D.C. And for a guy who didn't want to own one house, this is kind of a nightmare. We have two places to take care of now. You know, you need 2 irons, 2 refrigerators, and I have 2 yards that are not well raked for grass or leaves. So that's one of those further adjustments. And perhaps one of the things that doesn't get you at any particular moment, but you sort of notice after a while, is just the process of having become a public person. When I walk around now, I'm almost always recognized, but I'm almost always recognized as one of 3 people. Gary Locke, myself, or a third kind of catch-all category of, weren't you my dentist about 7 years ago? Weren't you my brother's pharmacist about a decade ago? Sort of that catch-all category of, in the Pacific Northwest, you know, the Asian face from someone's personal past. And I don't mind that at all. I think it's a wonderful thing to be recognized, but we should all be careful of what we wish for. Because, you know, the price of some modest success in this public arena is that it becomes a little bit harder to have a romantic evening out with your wife. It becomes a little bit harder. Well, if you go to the market on Saturday morning and have your hair standing straight up, you might hear about it from several different sources. So you know, that's just part of that personal adjustment process. But you know, even with these personal challenges, this has been a remarkably rewarding and productive 11 months. And I'd like to talk a little bit about education, which is the centerpiece of what I've cared about for a very long time, what I talked about during the campaign, and then some other issues relating to research and opportunities, and basically the appropriations process. And I guess I'd like to, instead of belaboring policy issues, I'd like to tell just a couple of stories, I guess. You know, the centerpiece of what I'd like to talk about during the campaign was education and increasing opportunity. And when I got to Washington, I landed a spot on the Education and Workforce Committee and a spot on the Science Committee. Now, one of the most important things that I think I was pushing for is class size reduction. And if you all aren't convinced yet that class size reduction matters, there are studies from all around the country that shows when you reduce class size in the early years, especially in the early years, it makes a lasting gain in a child's education. Up to a 6-month or 1-year gain advancement at the end of elementary school or the beginning of intermediate school. It's very, very important. But you don't have to just believe the studies. Just talk to the teachers, talk to the principals, talk to the superintendents in our area who have been able to add 1 or 2 or 3 teachers as a result of the first year of the class size reduction program, which was put in place last year. Well, I think class size reduction is absolutely crucial. I started talking about it, not that it's just because this isn't rocket science. I started talking about it 6 months before the president presented it in a State of the Union address. So by the time I got to Washington, it was a big issue. Now, that's both good and bad, because big issues tend to get locked up in big political battles. The lock on this particular issue is such that the administration kept on delaying introducing its class size reduction legislation. The Democratic leadership kept on delaying introducing the class size reduction legislation to authorize it for an additional 6 years. I pushed and I pushed and I pushed, and everybody said, wait a little while longer, the timing's not right yet. And it wasn't clear to me when, if ever, the timing was going to be just right. So at the end of a particularly long day on the Education Committee, when we were working on a relatively meaningless, now let's cut straight to the chase, a totally meaningless non-binding resolution, people were fighting like it was World War III on a non-binding resolution. We spent about 12 hours in that committee, and then at the end of the day, I was sitting around with my staff at a conference room table. I thought, this isn't why I came to Washington, not to engage in this sort of internal politics, battling about things which are meaningless. Let's push forward with a class size reduction initiative right now. Let's not wait, we'll just push ahead. I thought I had gotten clearance from the more senior members of the committee, that everything was all worked out. But let me just put it this way. At one point during this process, although I thought I had said, is it okay if I introduce this legislation and carry this along? I'd like to work with you on this, to the most senior Democrat on the committee. At one point, I was told, this is my legislation. You don't invite me to come along on this. And it became a, I couldn't quite believe that this was happening. That I didn't care who got credit for it as long as we were moving on it. But Washington is a town where credit counts for a lot. But by having pushed this, the legislation was dropped sooner, probably several months sooner, dropped into the legislative hopper, and we got to discuss it a whole lot more, to work on amendments, to push for this. But it was not necessarily a pleasant experience, because there was one particular day when I was on the House floor, and the ranking member of the Education Committee, a fellow Democrat, this is in essence like being taken by the ear and taken to the principal's office. I thought I had cleared it with everybody, and these folks, this one particular gentleman said, so you're pushing this right now. Well, let's go see what Mr. Gebhardt has to say about this. And literally hauled me off to the Democratic leader's office, and that is the legislative equivalent of being taken to the principal's office. But it all worked out. It worked out in the end. We did not get the 6-year authorization, but in the November budget battles, we did get the next year of class size reduction done. That was $1.3 billion for the nation, and it will result in about 300 additional teachers for the state of Oregon, for our community. And the president recognized 2 senators, another member of the House, and me for hard work on this particular issue, and it really turned out okay. I just want to touch on one other area before getting to some future issues, and that is credit for this really belongs to a lot of my staff. Because let's face it, I'm new to this. I did not go to Washington knowing how the arcana of the appropriations process works. But you hire good people, you listen to what they say, and you try to follow good advice as best as you can select it. And after we had had some successes with transportation, with getting a research project on repairing organs at St. Vincent Hospital, very late in the process, we got notice that a healthy aging project that we've been working on all year long up at Oregon Health Sciences was funded. But coming from the negotiation background that I do, well, you know, you never sit pat on a hand. And this was it turned out to be the last week of the legislative cycle. But when I was told that we got this wonderful project in, it's $1 million project in federal money. It intelligently leverages state monies and private money for a terrific project up at Oregon Health Sciences. My immediate reaction was, well, what else can we get out of this? And there had been 2 projects that we've been working on all year long. One, a research project at the mouth of the Columbia in conjunction with the Oregon Graduate Institute and the Mertz Center out there. And the other was a library project at Portland State University. And I got back to Washington a little bit early. Very few other members of Congress were around. And I sat around with my staff and said, okay, since we're all here, what else can we get out of this process and how? And one of my staffers, Chris Porter, did a terrific job, identified one sheet of paper for each project, identified the staffers involved, and at about 8 or 9 p.m. on a Monday night, I actually found the staffer. There is such a person on the Appropriations Committee who is specifically in charge of library accounts. And when I reached her about the PSU library project, her response was, well, that's all well and good, but the bill is locked down. This is the final appropriations bill. And this is kind of like getting to the airliner at the airport and finding that the door is closed. Well, not giving up there, decided, well, look, just since I was talking to her anyway, we've been working this all year long. Here are the people we've talked to. It's a wonderful, deserving project, and I know that the bill is locked down and the chances are nil to slim. But if by any chance this bill opens up again, I hope you will keep me and this project in mind. That was Monday night. And 36 hours later, the project was in the bill. And I am told by a couple of authoritative sources, although I haven't seen it myself, that this project for PSU was literally carroted into the bill. That is, there's a handwritten carrot at a particular spot, and they marked basically, give PSU $500,000 for its library. So I feel particularly good about having stayed with that project in a persistent way. I think that some of the lessons I've learned from this 11-month period is that persistence pays. Persistence also sometimes makes people angry, but that's a risk that you have to run if you're going to do this job. You should keep on pushing for good projects, hire good staff, and listen to what they have to say. And coming back on and again, do not be shy about pushing the envelope and potentially offending folks at times. Projects for the near-term future. Some good things have come out of this past 11 months, but much of the work remains undone. I think that comprehensive campaign finance reform is one of the most important things that we can do. We got a small piece of the legislation done on the House side, but even that modest reform did not get done in the Senate, and we need to push on comprehensive campaign finance reform. I think that common sense gun safety legislation is very, very important to do. On this issue, it's the reverse. The Senate got some modest steps into a bill. The House did not, and we're going to have to work on this harder in the coming year. And finally, just to keep the list short, I think that a strong and meaningful patient bill of rights is incredibly important to do, not just for patients and physicians, but for the future of safe medical care and proper medical care across the country. Can we get it done? Can we get these things done? Maybe. But we won't know unless we persist and we push, and I intend to do that. And finally, in closing, why fight the battle? Why try to keep on pushing when sometimes even your friends sort of seem to indicate that either it's not worth doing or you're not the person to do it? Why spend all the time away from family and away from the place that I love best? Well, I think that it is an incredible gift that ordinary citizens are given an opportunity to try to make a difference. And I do believe that the public process makes an important difference in our lives. When I measure the separation from my kids early in the week on a weekly basis, I mean, it doesn't necessarily feel good to go away, but I think back to what my parents went through to come to this country. My father left when I was about 4 months old, and then they lived apart for 6.5 years. Now let me bring it back to public processes making a difference. My parents wouldn't have been able to reunite the family here in America, but for a very, very close election in 1960. If not for the election of John Kennedy, by less than 1 vote per precinct across America in that year, I would not be a member of Congress today. I probably would not be speaking English the way that I do, and I might not be in America at all. After John Kennedy was elected, one of the first things that he did was that he signed an executive order basically equalizing the chances of coming to America from all sorts of different countries. Within 6 months of him signing that executive order, my sisters, my mother, and I, after having been separated from my dad for over 6 years, within 6 months of that, we were on the big Silver Bird and landed at Fiorello LaGuardia Airport just about this time of the year in 1961. That was a public decision that made all the difference in my life. I don't know whether the difference I make will be to a child in Portland, Oregon, or in New York City, or in New Delhi, or somewhere else in the world. But I live by an abiding faith that the work that I'm trying to do now can make that difference if it is done right, done well, done persistently, and done with passion. Just as my parents made deep sacrifices so that I would have the opportunity to be an American, it is very much in the American tradition that every generation does work to improve lives for the next generation. That's what I believe this public process is all about. We are all part of the great experiment of self-governance, and you and I are in this joint venture together to make this wonderful system of government work, even if occasionally it has some inconveniences for each and every one of us. Thank you for your kind attentions today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Congressman. It's always a pleasure to have you appear before the City Club. You know, you spoke about being recognized on the street, and I couldn't help but tell the story that it reminded me of Johnny Carson when he was on The Tonight Show talked about this same problem of being stopped. In fact, he mentioned one time that someone stopped him and asked, "Aren't you somebody?" Maybe I'll have that experience sometime. Now to my question. I think all of us, or most of us, are familiar with your suggested changes in U.S. policy toward China, particularly regarding the most favored nation issue. But you mentioned having been at the WTO conference recently up in Seattle, and I think we might be interested in knowing of any suggested changes that you're proposing be made in American policy with regard to the WTO, and maybe more specifically, what impact those changes might have on Oregon.
I very strongly believe that on average, overall, trade is not only very, very important to Oregon, but has a net beneficial effect for Oregonians, for Americans, and for people around the world. Having said that, I think that we are in the midst of a sea change in how we deal with the issue of trade. 20, 30, 40 years ago, trade negotiation was done by specialists, and it was all about a few lines of tariff code. The negotiations tended to be technical, and we allocated that decision-making authority to other people. That is, in essence, we said, it's okay if somebody else makes the decision for us, because in many respects, we did not see its direct effect on our lives. That has changed. It is part of a larger process of change. It was not until the last GATT round, as you all know, WTO is a successor to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The GATT negotiations for a long time were about narrow issues, but in the last GATT round, there was an expansion to cover agricultural issues for the first time. There was an effort to include services and to start discussing intellectual property rights. So what we see is an expansion of the way that we talk about trade, the topics that it covers. And what happened in Seattle, I think, is in essence an extension of that expansion. And I think that it is appropriate to start taking into account a wider range of issues, to take environmental concerns into account, to take human rights concerns into account, labor, diplomatic issues. It's an awful lot to pack into trade discussions, but I think that unless we can do that, there will not be a solid consensus for trade expansion. And let me use Seattle as an example. There is no more trade-dependent city in America than Seattle, Washington. Washington State is a very, very trade-dependent state. And yet, in that environment, we have a very strong environmental movement, a very strong labor movement, and clearly people who care about a range of other issues. If in a highly trade-dependent environment, you cannot talk about trade without a lot of other folks basically getting very, very, shall we say, strongly interested in what you're talking about. If you can't bring all these issues into some kind of new synthesis, then you will not have a stable consensus to go forward. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that there is some kind of historical inevitability to trade expansion. I favor it. I think it's a good thing, but I think it has to be done right. Arguably, at times in the past, we had a more globalized economy than we did today. About 100 years ago, it's arguable that more of the world's net GDP was actually in flow internationally between different countries. But for reasons of war, depression, and otherwise, we had, in essence, kind of like a broken rubber band that snapped back. I think that's what we can't afford to do, to break a fragile consensus in favor of trade. We would break that consensus by not taking into account these other very important issues. Is it going to be hard to take those issues into account? Yes. Ever since I took office, and actually since before that, I have looked for literature, researchers at think tanks, at universities, about people writing about how you can incorporate more of these issues into a trade agenda. And I have to say that there isn't as much thinking and writing on this new synthesis going on as I would like to see. I haven't been able to find very much, but I think it's critically important that we build that consensus. It's that kind of consensus that a state like Oregon needs to depend upon for building, in a stable, step-by-step process, a more liberal trade regime for the future.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. David, it's good to see you here at City Club again. One of the hot issues of the day is the increase in medical care cost inflation after several years of relative calm in that area. Both patients and the employers who provide a lot of the patient coverage have been assailed by major increases in cost. And what the largest component in that has been the inflation in prescription drug costs. Recently, your colleague, Darlene Hooley, has been assailed by an interest group put together by the pharmaceutical companies to try and attack her effort to gain some kind of price controls in an era when the Oregon Health Plan particularly has been strapped for cash because of this same trend toward rapidly inflating costs. Do you have a position on price regulation of pharmaceuticals?
This is a problem that Darlene and I have both worked on identifying, that is, identifying that the problem exists, a pricing gap between people who are insured and have buying power through their insurance company or HMO and people who do not. I believe that Darlene is under assault for signing aboard a bill which is, in my estimation, a pretty good bill, but it's one that I did not sign aboard because I was hoping that we could find something better. It has some components to it that, I'm not very concerned about the large pharmaceuticals. I think that they will take care of themselves pretty well. They are, let's just say, better than average profitable in the American business world. But I am somewhat more concerned about smaller companies and startup companies and what the impact on those operations might be for some of the real innovative research. By the way, innovative research that the large pharmaceuticals tend to buy up by buying the companies. So I agree that a severe problem exists. There are several proposed solutions out there, ranging from one proposed by our senior senator to the one that Darlene has embraced. I have not yet embraced any of them, and it may come down to the best is the enemy of the good, and you just have to make a choice among second best solutions, or maybe, like the trade issue, it takes a little bit more work to find a better answer. It's something that I'm working toward finding a better answer on.
Congressman, I'm Don Wagoner, member of the club, and I am interested in finding out what you think would be common sense additions to gun legislation, and would you compare that to the various laws that are on the books right now and the desirability of enforcing those laws?
I think it's important to both enforce the laws that are on the books and also to make what I view as common sense improvements. I think that selling trigger locks with firearms, that's a common sense approach. Children seem to have a fascination with handguns it's a fascination that other things don't seem to have. And if you lock guns away from kids, you know, there's demonstrable evidence that it decreases accidental killings, accidental injuries, and I think that encouraging the use of trigger locks and making them more prevalent is absolutely crucial. I think that closing the gun show loophole, that is providing for uniform background checks, regardless of where you purchase the firearm, is an important incremental step. I could go on, but one of the things I learned in law practice is when you're ahead, sit down and...
David, Ned, look, remember, you're way ahead today. We've had a lot of discussion about the World Trade Organization and the reasons for all the problems they had, going all the way from speculation as to the secrecy of the meeting, the membership, and what have you. On the other side, the people who defend the fact that their sessions are not open is that they could not have the freedom of discourse and uninhibited talk if it were in fact open. Would you care to comment on that?
Ned, there's an easy answer to that, and there's a hard answer to that, and thank you very much. You know, it is, I don't think anyone can argue that the fundamental documents of our form of government, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they were drafted in closed rooms. Even today, certain rooms are closed. The jury chamber, deliberations between judges. And we have made some decisions about which environments we are going to keep closed so that there can be freedom of discussion. I think that trade ministers, foreign ministers will continue to need some private environments in which they can talk one-on-one or in small meetings. But I don't think that that extends to the general decision-making process of the WTO. I think that if we brought to the WTO process the degree of openness that we associate with the American justice system, that is, it's required to be open. You can participate and listen, that there may be some discussions you're not part of in the jury room or otherwise, but in general, you can participate, and that third parties can submit their views. I think that that kind of transparency is very, very important, and it is a necessary part of how we live today, because our expectations about openness today are fundamentally different from expectations 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And the scope of issues dealt with by WTO bodies is much broader than dealing with little tariff lines that they dealt with that were previously negotiated. Now that we are dealing potentially with the domestic laws of different countries, the laws of various cities and states and jurisdictions elsewhere in the world, I think it is absolutely crucial that we provide for a lot more transparency. Is that going to be absolute transparency? Probably not, because there still needs to be some part of the process where people can, at a minimum, talk one-on-one, and probably more than that. But a lot more transparency needs to be provided than is currently provided today.
Hello, David. Bill Parrish, City Club member. Congratulations. I have a tough question for you related to the meeting up in Seattle. What's interesting, of course, is the largest, most dominant corporation in the world is also located up there, the Microsoft Corporation. My question is this. Have you heard of this discussion related to Microsoft's financial practices and how it's affecting the public pension system, in particular teacher pensions in the country?
Are you talking about stock options and how to account for them?
The discussion related to whether or not it's a pyramid scheme. The Larry George Show, the Daybreak Larry George Show, KUIK.
Well, what I recall about the Larry George Show was a discussion about whether stock options are properly accounted for in the financial statements of not just Microsoft, but just about every high-tech company that offers stock options, and whether the stock is, in essence, properly diluted for the impact of outstanding options. Now, I think that options are an incredibly important way to reward people. And in this instance, I'm not talking about Microsoft per se, I'm talking about high-tech companies in general. Because in a lot of instances, there's high risk involved, there's potentially inadequate cash compensation for a lot of startups, and you want to be able to grant stock options. As for whether they are currently adequately accounted for or not, there are, I shouldn't say new rules, but there are rules in place that have been in place, I believe, for 7 or 8 years, which basically requires the company to either show the effect of the stock options in the body of the financial statements or in a leading footnote to the financial statements. Here I'm probably losing a whole bunch of folks and probably all of the radio audience or whatever, but I can't without more say that these accounting practices are misleading to the public. I know that there's a book out on that subject, and it's been very hot, fashionable talk, but I can't say standing here that I agree there's a systematic problem with stock options, and I'm eager to learn more. This is something out of my past that I actually like dealing with, and I don't get to deal with very much now. Yes, sir.
Morgan Pope, member of the City Club and Associate Dean in the School of Engineering at Portland State. Thank you very much for your work for the library, obviously, and for high-tech kind of things, and for higher ed. We're in the middle of a major initiative at PSU in engineering, science, and technology, and we think that's important for the economic development of the region, that we be here and we do it. And we'd like to ask you how we can work together with you and your colleagues to help us make that happen.
Well, this is an invitation that I would like to extend to everyone in the room and everyone beyond who sees or hears this. Please stay in touch. Keep your emails and letters and telephone calls coming. There is a distortive process in going to Washington. That's why it's so important to come home on a regular basis. If you're familiar with an issue here, and then you hear about the same problem from lobbyists in Washington, D.C., sometimes it's not clear that everybody's singing from the same page. And it's really important to come home and stay connected. Now, having said that, it's really important for, I think, everybody to keep the input going with their representatives, to keep an eye on their representatives, to keep an eye on the folks who are supposed to be representing you as lobbyists, as well as folks who are supposed to represent you as public officials. Participation is key, and I really, really strongly encourage it, and that goes for PSU and some of the other institutions around here double. As you know, I think that it's really hard to get a break in this life these days without getting a good education, a good K through 12 education, a good college education, and potentially a graduate education, and having good research.